to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm out for a bit of a drive because we've been at home decorating and things like that, been going a bit stir crazy, so I thought I'd just pop out and do some errands in Peggy today. But today I'm actually going to talk to you about something related to much longer trips and road trips and things like that, and that is the topic of service stations, which might not sound all that interesting, but actually I've found has had quite an interesting history, and I think that will give us a bit of an idea about what we might expect to see at the side of roads and how it might be something really quite familiar to what our classic cars are used to. So recently I've actually had the joy of enjoying some really nice high quality roadside entertainment places, I guess. For my birthday I actually stopped off on the way back from Skegness at S5 Cafe, and you guys know that I've been there quite frequently since discovering it, and also in kind of the opposite direction to me, I'm really quite fortunate. We have Herbie's American Diner that is alongside the A14, and we took the Women's Drivers Social Club there at the end of the day when we had the meet quite local, and also I met up with Charlie there not long before that as well. So I'm really fortunate that local to me I've got some really great kind of roadside options for if I'm on my way home from somewhere, or if I'm out for a day out and kind of want to stop off and grab something quite quick and easy to have before I get home, kind of thing. And actually they in themselves are a kind of destination service stations, which is something that's quite unusual, but it is something that I think is growing in interest. Quite recently as well, I stumbled across a book called The Extra Mile in a little local farm shop to us, and bought it for my parents because they quite frequently do longer trips with both their classics and also their camper van, and it's a whole book of alternatives to your traditional, well, I will get onto that, whether they are actually traditional, but the service stations that you're perhaps most used to seeing that offer a little bit something different and a bit more refreshing when you're on those longer road trips. And it's got me thinking about whether that's something that we're going to see more of this more unique roadside experience going forward, and whether it's going to kind of bring us back to that golden age of roadside motoring that happened when the motorways were introduced, when Peggy was originally hitting the roads, and how much of that is going to be spurred on by the rise of electric vehicles. And I think it's quite interesting to think of it being quite a circular situation like that. So I guess somewhat naively, despite loving classic cars and all that sort of thing, I'd assumed that most kind of roadside services had always been the sort of things that we see now: the welcome breaks, the motos, the road chefs, those big kind of sprawling shopping malls esque things that are at the side of roads that always have the same sort of things inside, and you can kind of know exactly what's in there, and it's kind of a bit bland, very utilitarian, very basic, and essentially just a loose stop, a quick drink stop, a driver swap, whatever it might be, at the side of the road. But I was put onto a book that a friend of mine is using for her PhD called Reading the Everyday, and I actually used it a little bit last year when I spoke about motorways. And within this book they talk about the concept of non-places, these places that aren't destinations, they aren't kind of anything more than a thing that you pass through, essentially like an airport foyer or a service station. It's something that has become a kind of in-between space, a space that is got a weird agreement with society about its use and kind of sits somewhat separately to the rest of society. It's not part of a town or village or anything like that. It's literally a roadside existence in itself, and these were obviously a concept that grew out of the way that we live modern life. They are a concept that came along because we introduced motorways post-war and acknowledged that drivers were now going to be travelling much further than they ever had before and taking much longer journeys than they ever had been doing before under their own steam. They weren't using the rail network and things like that, so they'd need to be able to stop, they'd need to be able to have breaks and perhaps fill up on fuel and food. And as a result of this, the government, which again, something I had no idea of, the government introduced the necessity for these roadside stops for safety and regulated and owned all of the locations up until the 1990s and leased them out to people to run. And when they were first introduced, they were a hugely interesting piece of our culture. They were something completely different to perhaps anything else like them. They were, I mean, the motorways themselves were drawing huge interest from the public because you could take your car, really see the speeds that it could go at and experience your car in a different way, make huge amounts of travel, and people were, in the early days of the motorways, stopping at the side of them, having a picnic on the kind of grassy embankments and stopping at bridges and things to watch cars go by. So it wasn't just a concern in terms of the safety of drivers carrying long distances. The motorways being novelties in themselves meant that they were drawing crowds and interest, and we needed something that was going to offer a safe place for people to engage with this interest, because they were going to stand on bridges and things like that regardless. So if we could offer them a way to access the interesting new feature of our country, then we could perhaps reduce accidents and things like that. So a lot of these early roadside service stations were architecturally interesting, and some of those still remain. Markham Moor is quite a well-known one that's now a Starbucks, but is a listed building and being quite architecturally interesting, and has a feature that allowed people to kind of make a bit of something of their stop. It wasn't just a stop for the necessity. They often had a variety of cafes that offered different levels of dining service. They were quite comfortable options for dining services. They contributed to the up-and-coming car culture with young people. They acknowledged that some young car owners would be interested in racing their cars up and down the motorways, particularly when they were unregulated on speed, and perhaps giving them a 24-hour destination, as service stations were then, that offered pinball, food and things like that. We could profit off them, but also make the most of these areas that were being provided. And this unique kind of setup with interesting locations that were enjoyable to be in, these spaces that offered some forms of light entertainment if you were on a longer journey to break up the journey, that offered something that was often a reflection of the local area. They were government-owned places, but they were owned, leased by local people, and so they were sometimes a kind of micro experience of the area that you were driving through, which I think you get to see in some places abroad nowadays, but you don't necessarily get in the UK anymore, because so many of our service stations are kind of universalised. And that came because, well, initially the novelty of the motorways wore off and the service stations started to have less engagement from the public and were gradually transformed into utilitarian spaces. And furthermore to that, towards the 90s, when John Major's government came in, they were deregulated by the government. The Department of Transport no longer kind of leased them out, and whilst there were still regulations on the fact that all service stations that are motorway side have to offer kind of toilets and picnicking and a space to do emergency repairs on your car free of charge, and there is that possibility of being able to engage with them free of charge. You can go to the toilet free of charge, you can sit and eat your food free of charge, you can just have a walk round and a stretch of your legs, all of that kind of thing you can do without having to spend anything. And actually a lot of people don't. A study that was referenced within the Joe Moran book talks about the fact that on average people spend about 20 minutes at a service station, and they spend, half of them don't spend any money at all. It is just a pop in and leave kind of situation. And this deregulation was when we saw the big players like Moto and Welcome Break and Road Chef start to make the service stations that I've always known, the big kind of utilitarian shopping mall-like buildings that are all one level, take up approximately 40% of the land allocated, with the rest of it being given to parking. They often have a small hotel, travel lodge, daisy and that sort of thing attached, where people can stop over for the night if need be on longer journeys, and it fills that need for a comfort break, but not much more than that, because for a while now that's what cars have needed, that's what drivers have needed. It's been a short stop. But I think there is a growing interest, certainly, in providing something a bit more to drivers. I myself, whenever I plan a longer trip, very rarely plan for us to stop at a service station, because ultimately I know that that's not going to give me the break from driving that we need. So on the way back from Wales, one of our first trips with Peggy, we did a good hour and a half stop at RAF Cosford's museum. It had a cafe, it had a big car park that we could stop in. We paid for parking, but it was free to walk round, and I felt refreshed when I got back into the car, because it had been an extra part of our holiday. It extended our holiday rather than it just being a rush back once we'd had to leave the room. but also it broke up that journey in a way that was kind of meaningful. We did the same when we travelled down to the south coast and we stopped off at Oxford. We did the same again when we went up to the Lake District and we made a stop on the way back at Holmfirth's carding shed. And those are kind of like the service stations-ish, the services that are mentioned in the extra mile, in that they offer something a little bit different, a little bit more. They are a little bit further off of the main roads, but you get more from making that trip. And even when you stop at a services on the motorway and it's something a little bit different, it really stays with you, because you're so used to them being these generic ones that when there is something a little bit different, it stands out, and you make the point of that being your chosen stop in future. I think it must have been maybe after March of last year's Resto show, I found at the time, pretty newly opened rugby services on the M6. And whilst it's owned by Moto, who are one of the big services owners, it felt very different. It's a 2021 opened services, and it's got a huge offering in terms of space to walk around outside. It's got water fountains, it's got a child's play area, and I remember thinking, wow, this feels so new and fresh. You could see yourself spending a lot more time here than you would normally at a service station. And actually, whenever I've gone down the M6 and A14, if I need a stop, that is the services that I now choose to aim for. And I'm not alone in that. I actually did a quick Google of it, and that services offer, it got like 100% satisfaction survey from 31,000 people that were surveyed on it, and there was hugely positive compliments of the services. And you just think it's not very often that people give feedback unless it's negative. So for so many to give such positive feedback about that services, it really does say something about the fact that it stands out to people, that it offers something a little bit different and a more of an enjoyable stop. And that services is also well noted for having some excellent electric charging points, and I think this ties quite nicely into what I'm saying. People, if electric continues to at least increase in its use, people are going to need to take longer service stops. The average of 20 minutes that people spend at a service station is not going to be long enough to really add any meaningful charge to a lot of electric vehicles. So you are going to have to take, on those longer trips, a bigger break. And so something that is a more interesting, more unique service station, even if it's a little bit further off the route, is going to appeal, because you're going to have to spend that bit longer at the services to get some charge to be able to continue your onward journey. So having some excellent green spaces, having a bit of a taste of the local environment that you are passing through, because motorways are so far removed from the beautiful parts of the country that they're often passing through. Being able to get a small experience of that, I think, will help massively, firstly, improve all drivers' safety in terms of people making meaningful breaks and stops, but also offer something in terms of the growing electric drivers who are wanting to take longer breaks. So ultimately, this rise in interest in unique, more individualistic service stations will ultimately make the service stations that we start to see almost reflect more of what Peggy would have seen when she was initially on the road. Driving, I think, is going to become more and more of a luxury, more and more of an event, and so making the most of not only getting the destination, but also the process of getting to destinations will start to feel a lot more like when cars first came around. And I think the way that roadside culture looks and feels will change as part of that. If you are interested in planning out your road trips, especially in your classics, and making more of the drive there, and you're looking for some interesting stops to make along the way, or perhaps you're, like I have been, looking for interesting places that have got good connections to main road links so that people can attend meets and gatherings and things with ease, then I'd really recommend the book that I got my parents. That's called The Extra Mile, and there's some really interesting places, and it's all set out along the road network, designed to be kind of something you keep in your glove box, and your passenger can kind of say, okay, we're on this road, these are the options that we've got at these junctions, kind of thing. Also, if you're at home planning, you can make good use of a lot of great resources. I noticed that the Detour website has got a section called Pit Stops, which is gradually growing and listing some interesting places that you can stop off at for a short period of time to stretch your legs, take in a bit of the local culture, and really add to your adventure of getting to wherever it is that you are going. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a little bit about kind of the changing culture around roadside stops, and learn a little bit, perhaps like I have, about kind of the fact that roadside stops haven't always looked the way that they have. They haven't always been so bland. And also that if you are a UK resident, our experience is actually quite unique to us. Other countries have very different services, which I had no idea about, but the American and the European roadside culture is, again, a completely different thing that is totally unique to the way that it was introduced in their countries. And I'm really excited that hopefully we'll be taking Peggy abroad this year and get to experience that firsthand. And I'd love to hear if your services are kind of a very typical experience of your country, or whether you've travelled to other countries and experienced something different as well. Have you got a favourite services like me that if you're on a certain road you always make a stop at? I know that the T-based services is one that has really survived all of the changes. It opened in 1972 and then opened the southbound side of things in the 1990s, and seems to have excelled and sat outside of this utilisation of service stops. But I've never visited, so perhaps you can tell me whether that's a worthwhile stop if I'm ever going up that way. Have you got a service station that you enjoy so much you go to specifically, regardless of whether you're kind of passing or not. You might make a specific trip to there. I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts, and in the meantime, drive safely and happy motoring.